This is episode 111 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. This week we are going to talk about bail reform and an issue that Rio Grande Foundation has done some work on. It's definitely generated a great deal of media attention and controversy. And our guest today is Lauren Krasai. She is a senior policy analyst with the Justice Action Network. Welcome to the show, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and can you briefly describe your organization and its role as advocating for and being expert on the bail reforms that were put into place in New Mexico? And then we'll talk a little bit about specifically those reforms, but, you know, a little bit personal story and, you know, what Justice Action Network is all about.
Sure. So the Justice Action Network is the largest bipartisan C4 organization working to reform the criminal justice system at the state and federal level. We work in a number of different states, I think 17 this year, New Mexico being one of them. And we also work at the federal level. We were involved in passage of the First Step Act, which was signed into law by President Trump last year. So we work on a number of different criminal justice reform issues. Bail reform is one of our issues, but we work on a number of different issues ranging from, you know, pretrial to post-release, you know, sentencing reform, occupational licensing reform for those with criminal records, reentry issues, just, you know, issues that folks deal with once they are released from the criminal justice system. We work on probation, parole, pretty much anything and everything. You know, obviously in New Mexico, bail reform is one of the issues that we are focused on. We were not involved in the ballot initiative, which is originally what started bail reform in New Mexico. And we haven't been very involved in implementation of bail reform, but we have, you know, worked with some folks on the ground just to make sure that New Mexico is, you know, keeping on the right track and that they are, you know, their pretrial system is one that is based on risk, not on one's ability to pay. And so, you know, we've kind of been on the ground just meeting with folks and making sure that we can be helpful in making sure that the pretrial system is moving in the right direction in the state. All right. New Mexico has been an exciting place to be.
It always is, but this issue has certainly been front and center with a lot of folks. So what did happen in New Mexico on this issue? And, you know, how did bail work before? How does it work now? Or the pretrial system, I guess, would be the more appropriate way to say what's going on now. But kind of walk us through before and after and how it's supposed to improve things.
So I will just say, as a full disclosure, I'm not an absolute expert in how the implementation has happened in New Mexico. I can give sort of some broad general sort of what has happened there. So don't quiz me on the nitty gritty details because you know, I just know kind of the general overview of what's happened and what has happened since I have, you know, more sort of experience in. So just going back to the history, I would say that, you know, prior to the bail reform ballot initiative that passed a few years ago, New Mexico, you know, routinely jailed individuals who were arrested for crimes. They would set a bail amount that they would have to meet in order to be released pre-trial. And of course, these are individuals that have not yet been convicted of crimes. They've just been merely accused. And individuals who cannot afford to post their bail, they would languish in jail pre-trial until their trials or until they pled guilty or, you know, the resolution of their cases was reached. Now, the ballot initiative that passed, it eliminated cash bail for all offenses, but it allowed individuals to be detained pre-trial if they posed a risk to public safety. And so the way that works is that, if a defendant is charged with a really serious offense, they have a history of, skipping their court dates or just violence, they're a repetitive offender type of situation, the prosecutor or the state, makes a motion to detain this individual pre-trial, and then the judge gets to determine whether or not that person effectively poses a risk to public safety, and that their detention is warranted. And so, and this allows individuals who, previously were charged with low-level offenses like drug crimes, petty property crimes, and things like that, to be released pre-trial, so that they aren't, their release isn't just solely based on their ability to pay cash bail. And so that is what happened with the ballot initiative. And then after that, the Supreme Court had to put in rules in place just for procedure and how this worked, because as folks who listen to this podcast know, usually ballot initiatives, referendums aren't always the best way to legislate. And sometimes they leave out important details. And so, the courts needed to sort of figure out the rules and the procedures and how this actually would work and be implemented, which they did in 2018. And so now we have this system in which, as I described before, prosecutors are required to file a motion to detain for individuals who they believe pose a risk to public safety. The burden of proof to show that they pose a risk to public safety is on the state, and then judges can make a determination as to whether or not this person should be detained. So that's kind of where we're at.
Okay, so this was passed. What year? Remind me, was the constitutional amendment passed by the voters?
I believe it was 2016.
Okay, and it's been in effect for a couple of years now, but it's really only been implemented with something that is kind of called the pretrial assessment tool by Bernalillo County. The rest of the state was impacted by the constitutional amendment, but the pretrial assessment tool that is it your organization that developed it, or the Arnold Foundation developed it, which the Bernalillo County has been using. So talk about how you assess the likelihood of a criminal to be offending out when they're out on bail or out waiting their trial versus not. I mean, obviously we don't need to know all the nitty gritty, but talk about that in Bernalillo County versus, say, the rest of the state.
Yeah, so Bernalillo County utilizes a pretrial risk assessment tool that was developed by the Arnold Foundation. Basically what this tool does is it has information about the defendant, that, the previous number of charges they faced, or not charges, convictions, whether or not they've skipped court dates before, all sorts of information about their background, all objective factors that are designed to just be as neutral as possible. And it spits out basically a risk score for certain individuals that the judges then have before them in Bernalillo County, and it helps better inform their decisions about detention. Now, this is just a pilot project in Bernalillo County. I'm hopeful that other counties will start utilizing a risk assessment tool, because it basically just provides more information to judges about the defendant that is before them. It doesn't require that they detain somebody or that they release them. So if the score is low, it doesn't require that judges release that individual. It simply just gives them more information to have before them as they're making these decisions if a prosecutor files a detention motion. And so, yeah, I mean, Bernalillo County has been using this pretrial risk assessment tool, and Other counties, you're right, they don't use that, but they still, when it comes to determining risk individuals pose, in other counties, prosecutors are required to file information. Like they can't just say we need to detain this person, and they don't have to file any associating information, right? They have to make a case for why this person needs to be detained. And so they also present sort of their own analysis of the defendant, their criminal history and things like that, and judges can weigh it. But in Bernalillo County, they have this extra sort of risk assessment before them, the risk score that helps inform their decisions.
Got it. So in practice, it's obviously challenging sometimes for government officials and overburdened criminal justice system in Bernalillo County to implement these kinds of reforms. And you obviously, anytime a new system comes into play, there's concerns, questions, and a crime happens, and suddenly the system in place now is the cause of all bad things. But there are at least some that are calling it a catch and release system, that want to reform the bail reform, do something differently, even go back to the traditional cash bail system. What do you think about the charge that this is a catch and release system? Do you see these people as just blowing smoke, or is there something happening that may be not intended? Anything that you've seen in looking at New Mexico?
Yeah, well, I would say, no system is perfect right now. And in New Mexico, certainly this is a relatively new reform. And while the state is certainly heading in the right direction as far as what a good pretrial system looks like statewide, there's still a long way to go. And I would say that for those who are arguing that a better system is one that involves cash bail, I mean, just what we have seen in other states, I mean, cash bail doesn't look at a person's risk, right? So like the way that cash bail is set, it's like set for everyone, including people who pose a threat to society. And the way that it works is if you are able to afford your cash bail, then you can get out pre-trial. It doesn't matter if you pose a risk, if you're going to go right back into the situation where you committed a domestic violence, there was an act of domestic violence, and you're able to post bail. Well, where do you think they're going? Right back to that family situation, and there's really no sort of checks on a system that just relies on cash bail and not other intermediary pretrial sort of release decisions. And so I would say that like the idea that like cash bail has better results for public safety is just false. I mean, we've seen studies that have shown that that's not the case. And just as I outlined, basically like the whole premise of bail is just that if you can afford it, you can get out. If you can't, then you're stuck in jail. And so, a system that is just based on cash bail and like individuals who are charged with low level offenses who can't afford to get out, they're taking up jail space. They're taking up criminal justice or resources, taxpayer dollars that are being spent on this person's incarceration pre-trial when they could easily be returned to their communities, and no one would be harmed in that decision. And so I think that the way that New Mexico's system works now is that it's more aimed towards a system where like the riskiest individuals are incarcerated pre-trial, and those who don't pose a risk, which is, I should have said at the outset, is the overwhelming majority of defendants in criminal cases. These are folks who are charged with nonviolent offenses. They have relatively low criminal history. They pose no threat to society. Their release at least poses no threat to society, and they can safely be returned to their communities, their jobs, their families, while their criminal charges are pending. So yeah, I mean, I think that the way that the New Mexico system is working now, I think is working better than it does in most states. And of course, there's always going to be sort of outlier cases where, the system didn't catch everything. And there may be individuals who are released who, shouldn't have. But I think to expect an entirely perfect system is just kind of unrealistic, because that's just not how it's ever going to work. But all we can do is try to improve the system, tweak it, and get to the point where it is a little bit more perfect than it was, in years past. So, yeah, I definitely think that anybody who's characterizing bail reform as a catch and release program doesn't really understand that the previous bail system was like also catch and release if only a person could afford cash bail. This one now, the system as it works, is just more based on risk, which I think is how a pretrial system should be based on. It should be based on the risk that the person poses to society, not whether or not they can afford to get out.
Yeah, and because of the gravity of this issue, I'm gonna ask another question relating to this, which there was a case, and I think you've probably become familiar with it, where a guy named Darian Bashir killed a UNM baseball player earlier this year. It really set off a whole round of critiques and conversations about criminal justice and bail reform. And the headline of the Channel 13 KRQE story is "Public Safety Assessment Suggests Releasing Darian Bashir from Jail." Now, it wasn't known, obviously he wasn't convicted at the time, but the story talks about the assessment tool saying that this young man should be released from jail. He had a criminal history, but cases were dismissed, including shooting a man in the stomach in downtown Albuquerque. They couldn't get eyewitnesses to cooperate. He was arrested again, shooting at another car. I know it's tough. You're right. It's very difficult to come up with a system involving human beings that is perfect. But I know you probably couldn't run it through the system yourself in terms of the assessment, but does it sound like this guy should be released from jail? Do you think it sounds true that the assessment tool would say that he should be released from jail? It seems to me that anybody who is reasonably accused of being a killer would never be released from jail. And I don't have access, and I don't know if you have enough access to the system to know if that is being used correctly to point towards releasing somebody like that. He was not released. The judge did not release him. So there is discretion there. Is that what we're kind of dealing with, is just hoping that the judges make the right decision ultimately?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I am familiar with that case. You're right. But the reason I guess I put up the disclosure from the very beginning that the nitty gritty kind of details I don't have access to. I'm not as familiar with exactly what the tool said or, how it came up with that determination. I wasn't not involved that deeply. So I'm glad I put that disclosure up front so that questions like this, I can just return to it. But I will say that, yeah, you're right. I mean, he was not released. And the judge made the decision that this person posed a threat and that he should be detained. In that case, prosecutors also made a motion that he should be detained, and the judge agreed. Now, as far as exactly why the tool had a low score, and it wasn't the lowest score, I think it was like a 3 or 4 or something like that. I mean, it was low. I will say that. And I can't give you an answer as to why exactly it was that low, because I'm not exactly sure what factors they consider when making these determinations. But I will say that while the individual had been previously criminally charged, like you mentioned, with some violent offenses, the charges were dismissed. And so the tool, as far as I understand it, only looks at, certain, convictions or actual criminal history. So if you're just looking at this person, if you were like a tool like this, you see that he doesn't have a criminal history because he hasn't been convicted. And actually, like the charge, like they were just dropped. And some would argue, and some have argued in the media, that the prosecution actually dropped the ball on those prior charges by dismissing them and not aggressively pursuing them. And that if they would have, perhaps the basketball player would still be alive today. I'm not going to pretend that I know all the details on that either. That's
Sure.
just what I've seen.
Yeah, I'll just read. I'll just read a quick quote from the story that kind of says what you're saying, which is one of the tools the judge will use is the public safety assessment, PSA, Bashir, the young man who is alleged to have killed the baseball player. He said it showed he had no previous conviction. He never skips out on court, and lists him as a 3 on a criminal activity scale from 1 to 5. I know, obviously you don't have the personal background with the assessment tool itself, but I think your point about the DA and his office, as well as judges. Now, the judge who ultimately put Bashir in jail was a good, solid, kind of a law and order, conservative oriented judge who wasn't going to just let this young man out. But an assessment tool is only as good as the people using the assessment tool. And I know you're not in the business of criticizing DAs and judges, but would you argue that very same point that we need people in place who are willing to use the assessment tool, and if it requires disregarding it due to a bad result, maybe like this case, then doing the thing that you think is right anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in order for a system like this to work, all actors that are involved in the system need to be doing their part, which was the case previously. There was just less accountability when there's, fewer decisions that are being made based on risk. And so like any system that is based on risk, I mean, we have to calculate that risk. We have to figure out how much of a threat does this individual pose to society, where, taking away their liberty before they've been convicted of a crime is warranted, which is, a pretty big deal. When you're charged with a crime, you're not yet convicted. And I want to remind everyone that that's who we're talking about here. And so, but for those who have been accused of committing heinous acts, prosecutors do need to file that motion of detention. Like if the state is going to charge you with a crime, they need to bear the burden of making that motion. And that's the system in which New Mexico is currently operating. And so if a prosecutor, for example, doesn't make that motion to detain, judges can't just make that decision themselves. Like the prosecution has to do that, which as they should, they are the state, they represent the state. So they need to be making that motion to detain. You can't just have some neutral party, a judge, making that determination. I mean, they are making the determination as to whether or not it shall be granted, but they can't be doing all the work. I mean, the state has to bear that burden. And so, there will be cases where there's somebody who's accused of a particularly heinous act, and in fact, that has occurred in New Mexico. There's been examples of, I might not be fully retelling this properly, but I know that there was an individual who was accused of sexually assaulting a very young child. And I think it was his girlfriend's child. And in that case, the judge had no choice but to release the defendant because the prosecution did not file a motion to detain. So and that serves as an example to show that if not all actors are coming to the table and playing their part, then there will be some outlier cases where the system did not work as intended, because this is a system where everybody needs to be playing their role. But in the case of this case that you referenced with the basketball player, all actors were playing their role. They did the right thing by, the prosecution filed a motion to detain and the judge granted it. And again, when it goes back to the PSA, the pretrial risk assessment tool, making a recommendation for release, like I said towards the beginning of this podcast, the PSA does not, whatever recommendation they make, judges do not have to follow it. It should be seen as another tool in the toolbox for judges to have when they're making these decisions. Sometimes it will recommend release for individuals that judges will see, and in their gut, they know, no, this person poses more of a threat than the tool is saying. But again, the tool can only analyze certain factors, because this person didn't have an extensive criminal history, and this was actually the first offense because the others were dropped or dismissed. I think that is just unfortunately why this person had a low risk score. And we can really get into it as far as, the previous charges, why were they dismissed? They shouldn't have been, and then this person would have had a much higher risk score, or actually this event wouldn't have even happened at all. But just to kind of take a bird's eye view of how the system works, I mean, just to reiterate, I mean, everybody needs to play their part in order for it to work well. But of course, there are always going to be mistakes, and all we can do is keep tinkering with the system and make sure that those mistakes become fewer and fewer.
No doubt about it. And thanks for bearing with us in some of those tough questions. I know it is a tricky thing to implement some of these policies in the real world, and they're obviously difficult questions and answers to be had. But let's talk more broadly about this kind of bail reform. I know we had an expert on from I think it was the Justice Action Network almost 2 years ago now, and I know this is kind of a growing trend around the nation when it comes to reforming bail because of many of the issues you referred to with people who have money. They can easily get out. People who don't have access to money cannot get out before their hearing is held. Are any other states considering adopting this, or what states have adopted it, and kind of give us a thumbnail sketch of the results of those states and their adoption?
Yeah, so a number of states are looking at this. I'd say this is also like a local jurisdiction type of thing. I know a couple of other jurisdictions have served as pilot programs for various risk assessment tools. And there are some states that have implemented risk assessment tools to better inform judges about defendants who are seen before them in order to sort of make sure that they're not needlessly detaining individuals pre-trial because they can't afford bail. So there are certain states that allow individuals to be released on their own recognizance, which means basically you're arrested and then they say, okay, you're free to go, just show up for your court date. I think in counties that have implemented pretrial risk assessment tools, they have seen their pretrial detention rates go way down because judges are using it and seeing that there are a lot of low-risk defendants that can be released on their own recognizance, and that bail does not need to be set in their cases. And there are others that are looking to abolish catch bail. I mean, I think the most recent example of a state that has done it statewide and hasn't just been done at like a local level is New York. The governor recently signed the budget bill, I think in April, which eliminated cash bail, but like New Mexico allows prosecutors to make a motion to detain particularly dangerous defendants. So it's not a catch and release or a get out of jail free card for those who truly pose a risk to public safety. And so that's the most recent state that did it. And it's also a very large state that affects, there's thousands of individuals in the pretrial justice system here on any given day. But yeah, I mean, I think just broadly speaking, the conversation has definitely started to change around pretrial, the pretrial system. I think that a number of lawmakers and just the public in general is starting to rethink how the pretrial system works, how it should work. And everywhere that we have polled on this issue, which Justice Action Network sometimes does public opinion polls, we found that in I would even say like the high 80s, even low 90% of folks support a pretrial system that is based on risk, not an individual's ability to pay. And so we're seeing increasing public support for a system that is based on risk, not one that's based on money. And we're also seeing, lawmakers start to have these conversations and really look at what pretrial justice looks like. I will say just anecdotally, when we go in certain states and we speak to different sheriffs or local jurisdictions, either the courts or whoever is familiar with how their pretrial system works, we hear again and again that jails are being filled with folks who they just simply can't afford to be there, and it's a huge expense on taxpayers, especially in these smaller communities where they have these jails that are just like filled to the brim with folks who are arrested for low-level charges and they can't afford to get out. And so they're like, we don't want to detain these people, but, we kind of have no choice. And so I think that, the conversations are starting to be had. And, from just a fiscal perspective, from a public safety perspective, people are starting to understand that like the status quo is not sustainable, and that a system like one that New Mexico implemented is the way that some folks are starting to go.
Great.
Yeah,
well,
it's an interesting time. Lots going on.
Sure. Yeah. So anything else on this issue that you'd like to share with our listeners, about pretrial detention in New Mexico or around the country? Any, because this is obviously, crime in Albuquerque. Crime is a very, very hot button issue. It's something a lot of people, I would say 99% are really concerned about. And this bail reform has been painted by some, maybe many, as being a primary culprit in pushing that crime rate up. But I think you've done a pretty good job of responding to a lot of the assertions made by its opponents. But I just didn't know if you have any other things that you want to say about the issue before we let you go today.
Sure. So I will say that like pinpointing the cause of crime is a very, very tricky thing to do. It's very hard. And there are always multiple factors that, are involved when it comes to the crime rate. I think anybody who tells you that they can pinpoint one specific cause for an increase or a decrease in crime, they're lying because there are just a number of different factors that are involved with crime. And so I don't think it's fair to say that the bail reform is the cause of an increase in crime in New Mexico. I mean, it's just too complicated to know what some of these causes are. And other states that have implemented bail reform, I will say they have not, like they've seen decreases in crime. And so it's not necessarily just tied to one individual cause. But another thing that I will say, and something that I don't think gets enough attention, is that the consequences of pretrial detention for those who pose a low risk. And so I just kind of want to highlight this quickly before we go, is that research has been done on sort of new crime and recidivism rates for individuals who are detained for as little as 1 to 3 days pretrial. And they've found that individuals who are detained for between 1 and 3 days are significantly more likely to commit a crime pre-trial. Like that's after they've already been arrested for a crime. So they have new crime if they've been detained 1 to 3 days. They're 40% more likely than those who are released same day. And so when we're talking about bail reform in New Mexico, I think that's a really important statistic to keep in mind, because the vast majority of folks who are being released under this new bail reform law are those who are low risk, who don't pose a risk to public safety, and who are not going to commit new crimes because they've been released. Whereas, if these folks were detained even for as little as 3 days, they're significantly more likely to commit a crime pre-trial. They also, I think it's important to remind folks that those who are incarcerated pre-trial because they can't afford to pay, they lose ties to their communities, their families. If they're the sole caretaker for their children, they might lose their children. They might lose their jobs, their housing. Say they get arrested at the end of the month and they don't make rent. I mean, they can lose their apartments, their houses. And taking away somebody's liberty is a huge issue. Like it's really important to like, if you're going to do that to somebody, you have to have a very good reason. And so I think that because there are so many consequences to detaining somebody pre-trial, especially low-income folks who maybe they don't have salary positions. They work at a place where they're paid hourly. And if you don't show up to work one day, you're fired, you're replaced with somebody else. And if we're going to do that to somebody, we have to have a really good reason. And I think the reason should be that they pose a risk. And, I I do think that New Mexico is heading in the right direction. There is still a long way to go. I'd really like to see other jurisdictions implement similar risk assessment tools that Bernalillo County uses, so judges have more information when they're making these decisions. But yeah, as far as crime is concerned, I do think it's important to keep in mind that when we do detain individuals, even for as little as 3 days, their new crime commitments go way up. And so, we could potentially be seeing this as a crime reduction strategy. But again, crime fluctuates over time. And, I think over a year or two, we'll have a better idea of what, the crime looks like in Albuquerque, if this is just a temporary spike, or if this is, if crime is going to be going down. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. But I do think that, if we want to make communities safer in New Mexico, we have to have a pretrial system that's based on risk and not just allow people who pose a genuine danger, who have ties to money, who have the ability to get out, and who will go and commit other dangerous crimes. We have to have the ability to detain them. And if we rely on just solely a cash bail system, we don't have that ability. But under this new system, New Mexico does. And so, I think that it's overwhelmingly positive change for New Mexico. And I look forward and working with lawmakers to even further improve it, and hopefully get to a point where everybody is happy with how the system is.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Lauren. And what website or information would you encourage people to check out if they have more interest in your organization and bail reform in general?
Yeah, so our website is justiceactionnetwork.org. And yeah, I mean, if you want to find out more information about us, that's our website. You can check us out on Twitter. I'm Lauren Crisai on Twitter. We have Holly Harris and Jenna Mall as the executive director and deputy director. We're always tweeting about different things. And yeah, there are a bunch of different pretrial organizations that folks can look up as well. Pretrial Justice Institute and others who are working on this issue. And yeah, I don't have any. I'm drawing a blank.
That's okay. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thanks for listening.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. Thank you, Lauren. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.